Now welcome to another lightning response video, where this time the question comes to us from Retromaniac64, who asked, "Hey Thor, I know that a big reason why some people hated or still hate the prequels is because they explained the Force with Midi-Chlorians, but I'm sure that that's why some people loved the prequels, because it gave an explanation to something that's of the very foundation of Star Wars. Which to me begs the question, when do you think that magical/spiritual things like the Force should be explained? And why should they not? At what point does explaining something like that ruin it, and when does it enhance it?" And honestly, I partly think it's personal preference when it comes to this sort of thing, and partly what arguably serves the story better. It's partly what you simply prefer, and partly if it makes more sense to have a more hard magic system or a soft magic system for the story, with the difference between the two basically being the hard system has more defined rules and limitations that both the audience as well as the characters in story know and understand, while the soft system is far less defined and far more mysterious in nature, and thus tends to have no discernible limits and can sometimes therefore feel more powerful and wondrous. And I'd say when it comes to serving the story of Star Wars better, at least the original trilogy, I think a more soft system works far, far better there. I think Luke having to believe in and have faith in something he's never heard of or seen and that isn't fully known about or understood in the galaxy, speaking of the Force of course, I think it's far more powerful for his particular story. I think it's more powerful than, say, Yoda or Obi-Wan giving him a blood test and explaining Midi-Chlorians to him and how they allow him to connect to and use this energy field, and that the number he has in his cells kind of dictates his potential with it. Whereas in the prequels, with the Jedi Order being this very well-known and established organization across the galaxy, where the Force is something most people, I'd have to imagine, have heard of it, and where there is, I'd figure, proof of its existence, if you will, where you almost undoubtedly have, say, recordings of Jedi and other Force users doing incredible things, along with other concrete and well-documented evidence of its existence. Well, I think using a more hard system at that point, though certainly not preferred by all fans, especially after the way it's presented in the OT, but I think it can and does make some degree of sense in the prequels to go with a more hard magic system, or for that particular story. Doing it this way can fully explain the significance of the Chosen One. You can kind of show or explain just how profound the coming of Anakin is, that in a sense he breaks the known system or has more potential than anyone's seen before. Now, again, that doesn't mean you have to like it. I know a lot of people do not like Midi-Chlorians, and that is completely fine. I'm personally not a huge fan of them, though they don't bother me anywhere near as much as they bother some people, mainly because I think they were kind of misunderstood a bit, which we'll get to in a bit. But anyway, no, you certainly don't have to like them, and you could also argue and make a hell of a case that they didn't need to introduce Midi-Chlorians to convey the significance of Anakin Skywalker, either because there were other ways to do it, other ways to imply he may be this chosen one destined to balance the Force, like some sort of profound sign from the Force, for example, could have done that just as well or better than giving him a blood test that gives us a number higher than any other Jedi has, thus implying he may have been conceived by the Force, I guess. Or because we simply didn't need to make Anakin Skywalker some kind of chosen one, which is never even remotely hinted at in the original trilogy. It could have just been the story of a, sure, maybe stronger than usual Jedi, but a more or less normal average Jedi falling to the dark side, and how one day his son brings him back to the light. There was no actual need to bring in the balancing of the Force. Again, it is never talked about anywhere in the original trilogy. All that said, though, I don't know that Midi-Chlorians truly explain the Force. Sure, they begin to give us some insight as to the logistics of it, or how people in the Star Wars galaxy can kind of access it, but there is still a ton unknown about both the Force and the Midi-Chlorians. For example, is it having a high amount of Midi-Chlorians in your cells? Is that what actually makes you Force sensitive, or more Force sensitive, or gives you more potential? Or is it kind of the opposite? Does being Force sensitive or having a ton of potential for some reason, is that what attracts a high number of Midi-Chlorians to your cells, and thus measuring that number measures your potential? Also, Midi-Chlorians are not the Force or what generates it, which I think is what some mistakenly believed back in the days of the prequels and maybe still believe today. Even though, yeah, Qui-Gon kind of clears that up pretty well right in The Phantom Menace when he talks about how they allow those who have a high number of them and who can quiet their mind. It allows them to hear what they're saying, which is the will of the Force being spoken to them, meaning they are not the Force, but rather this sort of conduit for it. Even still, even without them being the Force, I can understand why people don't like any sort of number being attached to Force potential. I can understand not wanting it quantified in any way, shape, or form, and thus making it feel like there are genuine power levels that can be measured. That honestly doesn't seem to gel well with the original trilogy when Yoda's talking about how size matters not, because I don't think he was implying it doesn't matter what size you are because it matters more what your M count is. He was saying it because it was more about belief than anything else. Yet another factor to consider here, especially when you keep in mind what George Lucas said about what his sequel trilogy would have been about, that it would have gotten into the microbiotic realm and explained how the wills, in essence, how they are the Force and they travel around in people, using them kind of like vehicles or cars. Well, I think over the years, George Lucas's idea on what the Force is and how it all works changed or evolved, or he just kind of fully fleshed it out. I think back in the day, he didn't, of course, have all the details worked out just yet, and as the years went by, he thought about it more and more and had all of these, what he thinks are really kind of interesting and cool and unique ideas, scientific ideas, you could say, and he wanted to make it all known. Even if a lot of fans never wanted the Force explained scientifically, and even if in the original trilogy there is no mention of Midi-Chlorians or anything of the sort. Though yes, as some will no doubt want to quickly point out, George Lucas in a 1977 interview, which can be found in the Making of Star Wars book by J.W. Rinsler, which is an excellent book I recommend, Lucas did mention them when he said, "The Force gives you the power to have extrasensory perception and to be able to see things and hear things, read minds and levitate things. It is said that certain creatures are born with a higher awareness of the Force than humans. Their brains are different. They have more Midi-Chlorians in their cells." And as I was saying, I know a lot of people love to bring this up and say, see, there were Midi-Chlorians there from the very start, so there is no reason to get upset about them. And though, again, Midi-Chlorians personally don't bother me that much because they are not the Force, but the reason why people still can and do get upset about Midi-Chlorians, despite, yes, being an idea Lucas apparently had from the start, is because, again, they are never mentioned or even remotely alluded to in the original films, and so they seem like something that comes out of the blue, even if, yes, they were there all along. And so, to wrap this up and to quickly go back to the original question or questions, when does explaining too much kind of ruin the story? Well, again, it really depends on the story itself and what people prefer. I think the reason Midi-Chlorians were so disliked is simply because the Force, in the original trilogy, it feels very, very mysterious, and we all wonder about what it truly is, and what can be done with it, and what its limits are. And even though, arguably, explaining it more in the prequels makes sense for that story, well, it does for a lot of people. It begins to take that air of mystery away from the Force and makes it feel like something that comes down to the number of little organisms in your cells, which just feels, well, it doesn't feel as cool or awe-inspiring as it did when we saw Luke learning about it from Yoda back in The Empire Strikes Back. Again, it really just boils down to taking some of the mystery away from something and suddenly putting limitations on something that once felt limitless. That's what it all comes down to. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to take to the comments below and tell me what you think about Midi-Chlorians. Do you like them? Do they bother you? Or what? You could also feel free to ask a question for a future lightning response video. All you gotta do is start your comment off with "Hey Thor" and then ask away. But whatever you choose to do, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.